think it's fair to say that Jesus is probably the most contested figure in history. That means that people argue about him and fight about him. They debate who he was, what he might have said or done. They fight over what his intentions might have been, what his legacy is for us today. A friend of mine is a New Testament scholar, and one time he was at an academic conference, and at the front of the room there was a panel discussion going on. And one of the individuals on the panel was a very well-known New Testament scholar, and next to him, his former PhD supervisor. Well, my friend said that on this occasion, the two men, the scholar and his old teacher, almost got into a fist fight and had to be physically separated. Now, the truth is that you and I probably aren't going to get into a physical altercation over Jesus. But by our presence here today, we signal that we have at least some interest in the question, who was Jesus? As it is when we try to answer any question, it's important that we keep an open mind. Of course, debate over historical figures is not unique to Jesus. I recently learned, for example, about the historical debate over someone called King Richard III. Now, likely you haven't heard of Richard III. He was King of England for just a short time, from 1483 until 1485. Some people in his own day thought that Richard III was basically a good and a righteous king. He was someone who used his rule to look out for the poor and the vulnerable. Others, however, portrayed him as an evil and murderous villain, especially those kings who came after him, who belonged to a different family line, a different royal house. They said that he had a horribly hunched back. And even worse than that, he had a mind and a sense of morality that were as twisted as his body. This less flattering portrait of Richard III was portrayed in a play of William Shakespeare titled Richard III, and since then it has become the prevalent understanding of who Richard might have been. But amazingly enough, there exist today societies of amateur historians who come not just from Britain, but from all different countries all around the world, who are fans of his. And they go to great lengths to try and rehabilitate his image, to show posterity that he was truly a good and a righteous person. They're called Ricardians. A few minutes ago, we heard a brief passage from the Gospel of Luke, chapter 24. In fact, we heard the very last lines of Luke's Gospel. And they represent a story which is very important for helping us to try and figure out who Jesus really was. The story takes place on the first Easter Sunday. There are two followers of Jesus who have left Jerusalem and are walking to their home in the village of Emmaus. Jesus, the risen Jesus, comes alongside them and walks with them on their journey. Together, the two followers and the risen Jesus are having a conversation, but the two followers don't recognize him. As they approach their home in the late afternoon and early evening, they invite Jesus to their home for a meal. And it's only when they're dining together that finally they recognize who he is. Then once they've recognized him, he begins to tell them the good news of everything that has happened and how the purposes of God have been at work in recent events that they've witnessed and experienced. And then Jesus gives them some instructions about where they are to go from there and how they are to carry on their mission as his followers. And after their time together at the dinner table, they walk on to another village called Bethany. And there, Luke tells us, Jesus was taken away from them. Jesus was taken to heaven. This is an episode which presents all kinds of challenging questions for us. First of all, what happened that first Easter night? How could it have happened? In fact, we have an even more fundamental question than that, which goes to the question of when it happened. Luke here, for instance, tells us that this story of Jesus being taken from the disciples to heaven happened on the first Easter night. Yet in the book called the Acts of the Apostles, another New Testament book, which was also written by the same author as the Gospel of Luke, has Jesus remaining with his followers for a period of 40 days after the first Easter, and only then being taken from them into heaven. Well, I'm afraid to tell you that these questions will have to persist in our minds because I don't necessarily have the answers to give you. I think the existence, however, of these ambiguities and these tensions, these questions which don't have neat answers, lends us some sense of what the purpose behind Luke's stories might be. You see, in context, the account of Jesus being taken to heaven has a fairly clear purpose. For in the New Testament, we see a worldview in which God's created order consists of two parts, heaven and earth, or heaven and the visible universe. The heaven and earth, as we might describe them, are very close together. They are almost side by side, and yet, in a sense, are disjointed. The hope for the future that Jesus brought to us is the hope that one day God will bring heaven and earth together. They will be merged in an act of new creation, something which can be compared only to the first creation of the universe in its grandeur. And in light of that, we can see that Jesus came into the world as the very leading edge, if you will, of God's new creation. Jesus came from heaven to earth as the cutting edge of this merger of heaven and earth. This is why, for example, Jesus could go around telling people that the kingdom of heaven is at hand. He wasn't saying that the end of the world is going to happen any day now. He was saying that in his person, the kingdom of heaven had broken into the present age here on earth. I really think that this helps us understand some of the confusing and unexpected things that Jesus often said and did. It helps us explain, for example, his willingness to suffer and die. Because you see, in the kingdom of heaven, there is no violence. And as a representative of that kingdom, he endured faithfully whatever violence earthly rulers wanted to inflict on him. It helps also explain this idea of resurrection, that is a representative of God's eternal kingdom, even death could not hold him. It helps us understand why in Luke's narrative, Jesus might withdraw once again to heaven, awaiting the time of new creation when God would bring earth and heaven back together where they belong. This is why in the Christian tradition and in the very scriptures themselves, Jesus was known as Emmanuel, literally God with us. It's why Christians down through the ages have called Jesus Lord. Why we've worshiped and obeyed him. Now, of course, this is not a natural thing for us to believe. It's not something that we can understand instinctively. And in fact, we find in the New Testament Gospels that even the disciples of Jesus who were with him all the time didn't understand it. Here in this passage we heard this morning, we find Jesus having to explain yet again to his followers what has happened, what his significance and role is in God's plan. In fact, Luke uses a very rich phrase when he says that Jesus had to open their minds. He opened their minds to the ways that God was at work in the world and the ways in which Jesus himself was involved in God's plan for the world. You know, by the grace of God, we too might have our minds opened. We might have our minds opened to something that we don't currently grasp or understand, which is by definition what it means to have an open mind. And therefore we might have our minds opened to the ways that God might be at work in our world and in our lives. You know, I learned about this interesting historical debate over King Richard III in a wonderful TV documentary called King in the Car Park. These Ricardians, these modern enthusiasts for King Richard, believed that after having been killed in a battle on the outskirts of the city of Leicester in England, that he had been buried hastily and without any pomp and ceremony in a medieval monastery that is in the city of Leicester. Archaeologists believe that this monastery lay under a parking lot in the downtown of that modern, bustling city. Well, these Ricardians, these enthusiasts from around the world, raised tens of thousands of dollars and hired the archaeology department at the University of Leicester to try and dig underneath this parking lot to see what they might find. So they had made all of their arrangements, and they had made an agreement with the owner of the parking lot to use it for a time, to dig underneath it, and of course later on to repair it. And they were all ready to go, wondering where in this great big parking lot they are to start digging. Well, there was one parking space in the lot that had on it the letter R. I think it stood for reserved, as in it was a reserved parking space. However, the letter R also stands for Rex, the Latin for king. So they said, why don't we try digging under this particular parking space? Now, it's important to keep in mind that in the field of archaeology, you dig to see what you will find. You don't dig to find something in particular because it is just too unlikely. It's like searching for a needle in a haystack. Well, on the very first day of their excavation, the archaeologists found a male skeleton. It was the skeleton of a man who had died at the same stage of life or age as Richard had. It was a skeleton which evidenced the kind of battle wounds by which Richard had likely died. Amazingly enough, this skeleton also had a curved spine. Well, as the weeks and months went by, they found a living descendant of King Richard III, and they compared the DNA from the skeleton of this living individual. And lo and behold, there was a match. On the very first day of their excavation, they had literally found the bones of Richard III. On this very first day of digging, they had found a needle in a haystack. Now, unfortunately for these Ricardians, this skeleton doesn't tell us what kind of person Richard was, what kind of king he might have been. Can we ever know who Jesus was? For us, this is much more than an academic question, because it bears directly on us. It raises the inevitable question for each of us: who are we? Who are we as individuals? Who are we as the church? I think Will Willimon, a famous American preacher, made a good point when he said that as the church, we are not just a memorial society for a dead Jesus. We are a people called into being by the grace of God. We are a people who are brought together who have, by this same grace of God, our minds opened to the wondrous and amazing ways that God might be at work in our world and in our individual lives. It is by this grace and by this very open-mindedness, in fact, that we can have confidence and hope that this Jesus was and is the Lord, that he was crucified and risen, and that in him you and I might have life eternal.